Welcome. Today we are going to talk about Moses Maimonides, the Rambam. For Moses to Moses there is none like him, the greatest of the Sephardic Jews. Maimonides had the distinct privilege of incorporating different strains of philosophy into his own work. He has Aristotle incorporated. He uses some Arabic philosophy as well. We're also going to see an overlap between Maimonides and some of the work of Dionysius and what would also be incorporated as Neoplatonist thought. And so Maimonides gives us this great springboard to later medieval thought. And it comes out of Spain and then the rest of the life that he spent. And we'll spend a few minutes going into that. Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, the Rambam, Moses Maimonides. For Moses to Moses there truly were none like him. He has a mind that is prestigious, that goes into all these different avenues of Jewish thought. And he really shows and demonstrates the zenith of Jewish life. He has the most comprehensive mind within medieval Jewry, even surpassing noted people like Saja ben Joseph, the Gaon of Pumbedita, one of the most important minds within medieval Jewish history, and yet Maimonides is slightly above him. This is in part because he has the most comprehensive system to address Judaism. He embraced all aspects of Jewish literature, science, philosophy, and medicine. He will issue responsa, the jobs of the Gaons, as well, that dealt with controversies of his day. His family is from Spain, but he will have to leave to go to Egypt. Moses and his brother David had a jewelry trade, and David ended up dying in the Indian Ocean, and their money and his love was lost. The loss of his brother had a profound impact upon Maimonides, and he was depressed and will spend a year or so in bed mourning the loss of his brother. He will then go to Egypt, and he's in great demand for the court at this point. Eventually, he gets named the Nagi, or Nasi, the head of the Egyptian Jews. Essentially, it's an official job where he's the representative of the Jews for the court. And before this point, he was kind of an unpaid leader and untitled, but largely had a lot of the same roles within the community itself. Well, here we will see that he's going to read Avicenna and Averroes, and most of his early works are dedicated to medical theory, the main practice of what he was doing, and practice along with these intellectual and public affairs. Maimonides' works were rather proficient in addressing many aspects of life. As I mentioned earlier, his treatises on medicine was really how he spent the majority of his early career. These were all written in Arabic, and there's no mention of God in any of them, but we do see connections to philosophy as well. Specifically, his treatment of snake bites and their relation to the golden mean, borrowing this idea from Aristotle, right? That a little bit or too much in one direction or the other could be problematic, and yet we find issues with some venom that a tiny little bit of it might help you cure a disease or an ailment. The poison could give you some other benefits. Too much will kill you, but you have to know at what point does it do you a benefit, and he's drawing very clear connections to Aristotle in this work. He'll also address issues of diet and medicine. He was aware of psychological issues, and he tried to look for the underlying causes of diseases instead of just approaching a disease as it existed. He also, in this discussion, tried to come up with a possible cause of what diabetes was and addressed sexual health and aphrodisiacs that can help you out. One of which that was included was chopped onions. Not sure how effective that would be for all, but you know. And also touted the rigors of physical exercise. He'll also write the commentary on the Mishnah. He did this while he was in Spain, about the age of 23, 1158 or so, and we'll have this longer discussion of this and a further expansion on this pretty much until 1168. And he'll complete it in Egypt. During this time, he also knew the Talmud, the kind of oral law written down for Jews 400 and 500 AD, depending on which version of the Talmud we're addressing, the Palestinian or the Babylonian. But it essentially becomes the larger discussion of the law. And he knew this well enough to use his own memory for making his commentaries on the Mishnah. He also created a 13-article creed for Judaism, defining what it is to be Jewish, what's in and what's out, what's going to count as being Jewish and what's not. If you read these, it's fairly easy to find. You're going to notice that he's got different groups he's very specifically writing against. He's clearly saying that Muslims are not Jews and Christians are not Jews, but there's other groups as well, including the Karaites, to whom he is speaking, who are kind of Jewish. Really, they would identify themselves, but they reject the idea of the oral law. But Maimonides is talking about the whole Torah in this as well, and excludes the Karaites from being properly understood as Jewish. This creed was strong enough that after him, there's kind of different camps of Judaism. You're the Maimonists or the anti-Maimonists. You're either going to accept this as a basic creed or you're not. Again, he doesn't have the authority to simply say, I'm the Pope of Judaism, for instance, and you'll all accept this as a decree. But it's persuasive enough that it gives Judaism for the first time a very clear idea of what are the lines, what are these statements of faith that we all need to subscribe to. He'll also address what's known as the Mishnah Torah, another work, which includes the Yad Hazaka, the strong hand. And this, he completes it around 1180, and this is his second great legal work. It's the only one that he wrote in Hebrew. And he addressed the laws of relations of God and man, individual and civil and criminal law. In this, very importantly, he was asked on multiple occasions, since the Torah prescribes offering animal sacrifices, when should we do that? Should we be doing that? And his answer was, you should only do sacrifices in the temple. That's what the sacrifices were for. And obviously the temple is not something we can construct anywhere else. We can only do this when Jews hold Palestine. He also said this with the belief that it was probably never going to happen. It did. And so there is different challenges like, what do you do at this point? But there was this discussion. His impact in philosophy is probably the greatest work for what we're addressing here, and that's the idea of the Guide for the Perplexed. He wrote this in 1195, and it was translated by the family of Ibn Tibbon in this area of land between Spain and France, and will end up being important in the history of Western philosophy developments, and we'll have people reading it, including Aquinas and others. Now, this work is not very popular, except for in the realm of philosophy. And really the point for Maimonides in here is also to subordinate philosophy to revealed religion. For Maimonides, like for many of the other philosophers we've talked about, there is this struggle between faith and reason, and which one is more important. Philosophy, for Maimonides, is a valuable tool, but it's a tool to help you with what has been revealed by God. And he's a firm believer in the truth of Aristotle, but he's also a firm believer in the truth of Judaism. And he thinks you can wed these two together, and Aristotle can become subservient to Jewish life, to the revealed Word of God. That old question of what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem is something that's been used throughout medieval era, etc. And right, where does this philosophy have to fit within Jerusalem, the holy city, etc.? And he's saying Athens serves Jerusalem, and it benefits Jerusalem, and that's why we have it. One area we see this wedding of philosophy with revelation is his discussion of the creation of the universe itself. Maimonides proposes that there are three options to how the universe came into being. The first account is the biblical one, that God created it out of nothing. He also proposes that there's a Platonic view, that it was created out of existing matter. And the third would be that of the Aristotelian view, that the universe is eternal, and the world is a part of that eternal universe. So we have these three different accounts, the biblical, the Platonic, and the Aristotelian. He wants to point out very quickly that Scripture doesn't rule out any of these three views, as eternity or existing matter could have been defined as eternity beginning when God created the universe. And the matter could have been that matter that God created when God created the universe. So it didn't have to be out of nothing, because our notions of time are also a little bit different. What existed before time? Nothing. Eternity begins the second time begins, possibly. So therefore, we can kind of hold different unions of these different thoughts. Now, he says Plato could be correct, and Aristotle could be correct, and other views could be correct as well. But he says that the first view is most likely true, since there is a God. This is the starting point of his philosophy, right? And he says, which then should have different ideas that we would understand from this God. That this God is powerful enough to create out of nothing, so why would God need existing matter? Or to have the universe all perfectly there from the very beginning. So God can do whatever God wishes, therefore the first one seems more logical. And he also addresses issues of prophecy. Right? God reveals God's will and ideas and thoughts through prophets and prophecy, and he sees this as the epitome of intellectual excellence. He says the greatest prophet therefore shows the greatest excellence, and this, for Maimonides, is none other than Moses. And he said that this man would be the sort of Platonic philosopher king. The idea of what Plato would have wanted and how Plato thinks that we should be ruled was what Moses did. And prophecy can be a part of this creation as well, on account of human nature is made in this image of God, and therefore this universe has the opportunity to have punctuated moments where God intervenes through the life and works of prophets. In his treatment of philosophy in the West, Maimonides is known largely for his via negativia. In many ways, we have this kind of expanded discussion of what Dionysius did with his apophatic theology. Maimonides states, the people in question have, as it were, divested God of corporeality, but not the modes of corporeality, namely the accidents. I mean the aptitudes of the souls, of which are the qualities. Now you should notice here that the terms accidents here is something that's very much being borrowed from Aristotle, and Maimonides' reading and treatment of Aristotle largely through Arabic philosophy and this lens. This is well before we have anything really in the West. Aristotle's around, he's used it a little bit, but Maimonides predates Albert the Great, and his incorporation of Aristotle in a larger way, and being the teacher of Aquinas. Aquinas is usually seen as the ultimate translator of Aristotle for the West. But again, Maimonides is before all of that. He'll continue, on this it is said that the Torah speaks in the languages of the sons of man, but this is inexact, as God does not share qualities with man. Right? The language that's used is inexact because you wouldn't know exact language. It doesn't make sense to you. He continues, though an agent is one, diverse actions may proceed from him, even if he does not possess will, and all the more if he lacks it acts through the will. So he discusses things like fire. that it melts and it makes hard, it cooks and it burns, it bleaches and it blackens. Many of these same sort of examples that we addressed with Dionysius, we see expanded on by people like Maimonides. But Maimonides points out the weakness of our language, right? That many of these are opposites, right? To cook and a burn, we might see a connection, but melting, making soft, making liquid, and making hard, bleaching and blacking are opposites, right? And yet fire does all of these things. And if they were to look at these characters, we would not think that they are all attributes of one existing thing. And we would not understand that all of these can take place due to one activity, namely the quality of heat. And as mentioned before, right, the same boiling water can cook a potato or make an egg hard. The heat changes what it reacts upon, but if we were to just look at the reaction, we would think that it's coming from different sources. Different things are making one thing happen as opposed to another. Every attribute that is found in the books of the deity is therefore an attribute of his action and not an attribute of his essence, or it is indicative of absolute perfection. And so notice here that we're getting this division also between the actions of the god, or as people like Gregory of Palamas would address, the energies of God, as opposed to the essence of God, the actual identity of who God is. So our language is clearly incorrect because it's also addressing the wrong thing. We're addressing the effects, not the source. So he continues, if one describes him, God, by means of affirmation, one implies, as we have made clear, that he is associated with that which he and implies a deficiency in him. We're going to implying something that God is not, and therefore God lacks something as a result of this. So we can't say anything affirmative about God, as Dionysius would say, right? That we're going to have to use negative terms to define the infinite as opposed to finite terms, which can only be based upon effects, which can be contrary. So what is it we can say then of God? How is it we should approach this discussion? Because again, if the Torah speaks in the language of the sons of man, but not of the qualities of God, we are going to probably have to side with people like Palamas, who makes this division between God's essence and God's energies, that we only see the effects of God and not necessarily the essence of God. And we could speak affirmatively about those effects, but not about the essence of God. But Maimonides doesn't like this idea. Maimonides famously holds that God has no that outside of his what, and hence an attribute cannot be indicative of the two, of the one. All the more his what is not compound, so that an attribute cannot be indicative of its two parts. We cannot say an action exists only because of the energies, but not found within the essence. That they have to be identical in this way for Maimonides. This idea of divine simplicity is the argument that's going to be used here and is important for other scholars such as Aquinas later making this same sort of argument. But if God has no that outside of God's what, there's no accidents that we can say are about God, then that limits even more what we can say about God. Because if we only know what would otherwise be accidents, these energies, then we know that it's also limited. Because again, the Torah speaks in the language of man, not in the language of God. We know from other objects that there's things that are the effects of it, but not necessarily indicative of exactly what that cause is. We can't say anything, therefore, affirmative about God. This is the conclusion of not Dionysius's apophatic theology, but of Maimonides. So any statements we say are not affirmative in any respect. The way we look at things has to be different, has to be off. We have to only say that this is not a pipe. It looks like a pipe, but it's not a pipe. It's something different. Because your conception of pipe lacks some idea of what this actually is. More precisely, not the pipe, but is on the issues of God. We can say that God is not dead. We can't say that God is alive because God lives more than your understanding of life is. Therefore, we can't say that. We can only say that God is not dead. We can say that God is not a body, that God is not limited by this body. This is also a little more important for him in his articles of faith, denying notions of incarnation, etc. That God is eternal or without cause. That God is not powerless nor ignorant. Now again, we can't say that God is powerful because our notions of power are limited. And we can't say that even God is wise because God's wisdom exceeds what our notions of wisdom are. Therefore, we can say that God is not ignorant. Additionally, we can say that God is not inattentive nor negligent. Because again, our conceptions of our words are incompatible with the fullness of what God is. And Maimonides would point out that this is really what we mean when we are attributing these qualities to God as being powerful, knowing, and willing. The only conclusion from this science, as he's seeing it, is it entirely consists in our negating, with reference to God, some notion of which has been lent by means of a demonstration, that it cannot possibly actually be ascribed to God. That this is the conclusion if God is going to be more simple, if there is no that outside of his what. That even what we think we know, we don't know, because your knowledge is limited. Moving along to a couple other major takeaways from his work Guide for the Perplexed, if we're going to look in chapter 31, we will see that for the human mind, there are certain objects of perception which are within the scope of its nature and capacity. You know there are certain things that you're able to know. On the other hand, there are, amongst things which actually exist, certain objects which the mind can in no way and by no means grasp. The gates of perception are closed against it. There are certain things that you just know you will not get to know, right? The actual infinite qualities of God, for instance, right? Therefore, it's this discussion of the via negativia with Maimonides, right? Further, there are things on which the mind understands one part, but remains ignorant as to the others. Right? You might know a piece of a puzzle, but you don't know what the puzzle is. You've got an attribute of something, but you don't know everything about it. You don't know what it's truly like to walk a mile in somebody else's shoes. You might know details about them, but their life is still not something that you're going to know everything about. It says all of this is applicable to the intellectual faculties of man. There is a considerable difference between one person and another as regards of these faculties, as is well known to philosophers. While one man can discover a certain thing by himself, another is never able to understand it, even if he is taught by means of all possible expressions and metaphors and during a long period. His mind can in no way grasp it. His capacity is insufficient for it. Right? We know that there are certain things that you're not going to know. And that it's not a matter of training, it's just not there. Different people have different fields, different interests, different ideas that click with them. For some, philosophy is just beyond their understanding, and that they can read and read and read, and you're like, I'm still lost, I'm still confused. For others, you're like, I got that. That was simple. I had this and that, and it's just logical deduction. Maybe I don't understand all of it, but I need more training and reading, and I'll be able to speak eloquently on this matter. Same is true for sciences for some, or other attributes. So, right, we know that there's certain intellectual and psychological, emotional, many other faculties as well that allows one person to regard some ideas with ease and others to not understand it at all. So what are these causes that will prevent you from discovering the truth? Maimonides draws on the works of Alexander Aphrodiseus, who said that there are three causes that prevent men from discovering the exact truth. The first is arrogance and vainglory. Right? You think you're better than you are. You think you know more than you are. So you're just closed off to learning. Somebody wants to correct you and give you new information, and you just refuse it because you don't need it. You already know enough. Second, he says, are the subtleties and depths and difficulty of many subjects, which is being examined, right? Some subjects are just harder to learn than others. Some requires more training and patience. Basic math is easier than advanced math. Basic Newtonian physics, while it has its difficulties, is easier than quantum physics, which is perplexing even to a lot of quantum physicists. Third, we have notions of ignorance of what capacity to comprehend what might be comprehended. Right? Some people are just ignorant and they don't know where they're going with something. Right? You don't know what you're supposed to be learning. Words are speaking, and you're just like, I'm hearing what you're saying. I just don't know what I'm supposed to be picking up on. I don't know what should be highlighted and what should be important. I'm just lost. And he says that there is a fourth cause not mentioned as well, because it didn't prevail, and that being habit and training. Once again, we're going to return back to notions of Aristotle. You're going to learn some virtues and other things through habit, through training. That this is going to allow you to excel and help you to discover the truth, right? It's not just that you're ignorant or this subject is difficult or that you think you're too great, but you've lacked sufficient training, and therefore this habit of training is what you need to succeed and to excel. Maimonides' treatment of habit starts off with a statement that most of you would agree with, that we naturally like what we've been accustomed to and are attracted towards it. Why is it you feel like a hamburger instead of a hot dog? Why is it you are inclined towards talking to this person instead of that person? Right? The answer is because you feel like it. Right? You've been accustomed to it, that this is what you're used to, and therefore this is what's got value for you. He also points out that because of this, villagers rarely enjoy the benefit of a douche, of a wash, right? That villagers, common people, don't enjoy some of these other medical or social or habitual practices that he enjoys or that others do. So the same is the case with those opinions of man to which he has become accustomed to from his youth. He likes them, defends them, and shuns the opposite views. Again, this is what I grew up with. This is what I like. I don't like your ideas. They suck. Why? Because they're not the ideas that I grew up with. This is likewise one of the causes which prevent men from finding the truth, and which make them cling to their habitual opinions. You've got your opinions that you like, and therefore they've grown into be habits. You don't want the douche because you're acting kind of like one with your opinions, right? You're going to refuse the arguments of others just because they're not something that you want to have. Do not imagine, he says, that what we have said on the insufficiency of our understanding and of its limited extent is an assertion founded only upon the Bible. For philosophers likewise assert the same, and perfectly understand it without having any regard to religion or opinion. Right? The idea of what you like and why you like it is there not because of scriptural understanding or you're the chosen people or anything else like that. It's because it's what you like. It's what you do. It's what you expect. And philosophers have talked about the value and power of habit, including, of course, none other than Aristotle. And otherwise, all you're giving is just like your opinions. Right? What you're going to shun and what you're going to hold on to are formed by your habits, and your habits are formed by what you're accustomed to. Maimonides continues on in the next chapter. He says that we must consider that when reading this treatise, that mental perception, because it's connected with matter, is subject to conditions similar to those to which physical perception is subject. But we need to understand that our mental perceptions are a lot like our physical perceptions, that our mental abilities are not radically different than our physical abilities, that there are limits of what we're able to do. Right? Even though people like Kant would say the only real limit of our mind is knowing the mind's limits, Maimonides says, no, there's definitely going to be some limits. What those are is part of that discussion, but we all do have different limits, right? If a person studies too much and exhausts his reflexive powers, he will be confused and will not be able to apprehend even that which he had within the power of his apprehension. You can study something and look at something and get too confused, even though it's something you might even be able to know. You can become too tired and weary to be able to do what otherwise you were able to do. You can, through exhaustion, weaken yourself to where you can't do the task that otherwise you'd be able to do. In reference to Rabbi Akiva, he says that he, in peace, entered into the study of theological problems and came out in peace. That he calmed his mind before entering into these problems, and therefore he could address these theological concerns when he's coming through them. If, on the other hand, you attempt to exceed the limit of your intellectual power, or at once to reject things as impossible, which have never been proved to be impossible, or which are, in fact, possible, though their possibility were very remote, then you will be like Elisha Asher. You will not only fail to become perfect, but you will become exceedingly imperfect. If you try to take on too much, you're going to strain yourself. You're going to hurt yourself. But if at the end you're still working and tired, that's not the time to continue. Don't throw on extra weight after you've already completed your normal workout. Or at least not in excess. Ideas founded on mere imagination will prevail over you. You will incline towards defects and towards base and degraded habits on account of the confusion which troubles the mind. And the dimness of this light, just as weakness of sight causes, invalidates to see what you see of real kinds of real images, right? If you have a problem with your eyes, you're not going to be able to see and perceive things what you might otherwise see, especially when they have looked for a long time at dazzling or at very minute objects. But if you're spending all of your time looking over one little thing, eventually your eyes can become fatigued and you're not going to see it even though you could see it before. For example, we have Hume, who through his own study convinced himself that there's no cause and effect, and that this wasn't just hyperbole, but the actual nature of the way things were. And that it's just as reasonable to assert that the sun will not rise tomorrow as to say that it will. Why? Because you teased out an idea and you kept teasing it out. You accept a problematic assertion because it intrigues you. And instead of developing a secondary voice to be able to do that, where you can separate yourself from that, he kept teasing it out until he became firmly convinced of An idea that is problematic, if nothing else. Maimonides continues on the nature of knowledge. He says, though great, excellent, noble, and perfect, it is injurious if not kept within the bounds and not guarded properly. Right? Knowledge is great and excellent, but ideas can go a little bit too far. This is the same ideas expressed in the words of Proverbs, right? That it is not good to eat much honey. And in the words, neither make thyself overwise. Why should you destroy yourself? And don't take too much of a good thing can become a bad thing. Even with knowledge, you can tease out ideas and get too much of it. And too much of these things and you'll become sick. Too much food, too much study will drive you mad. Right? So this is part of the joy that Maimonides enters into here in the Guide for the Perplexed. Like, okay, tease out an idea a little bit, but know your limits. Know what's too much. Know what's going to get you sick and make you unhealthy. Find your balance and stay there. Beyond this, he says that there are 5 reasons why instruction should not be given in metaphysics, but should at first be restricted to pointing out what is fitted for notice and what may be made manifest to the multitude. Right? There's 5 reasons. He says, okay, let's not go there yet. You're not ready for this lesson, maybe. The first reason, he says, is that the subject is difficult, subtle, and profound. Instruction should not begin with difficult subjects, but on what is understandable. The second reason, he says, the intelligence of man is at first insufficient, for he is not endowed with perfection at the beginning. But at the first process, perfection is only in potentiality, not in fact. Right? So you might get to learn it, but you need to slow down and start with what reason you know, what reason is sufficient. The third reason, he says, the preparatory studies are of a long duration, and man in his natural desire to reach the goal finds them frequently too wearisome and does not wish to be troubled by them. Right? That there's a lot of work ahead of you, that you need to slow it down. And therefore, don't begin with the end goal of what you should know, but begin with something that's achievable. Right? You, he says, however, know how all the subjects are connected together. For there is nothing else in the existence of God and his works, and the later including all existing things besides him. We can only obtain a knowledge of him through his works. His works give evidence of his existence and show what must be assumed concerning him. That is to say, what must be attributed to him affirmatively or negatively. It is thus necessary to examine all things according to their essence, to infer from every species such true and well-established propositions as may assist us in the solution of metaphysical problems. Again, many propositions, based on the nature of numbers and of the properties of geometric figures, are useful in examining things which must be negated in reference to God. And these negations will lead us to further inferences. Right? That we need to start and say, what can we actually know? And many of these, we need to go back to that via negativia. There's certain things that we just have to say, before we can affirm anything, we need to start limiting. We need to find where are the limits and cut those out. Agree on what can't be done before going into the large list of what needs to be done. Know what your limits are. Know what studies that you need to do to get there. And then you can move forward. Consequently, he who wishes to attain to human perfection must therefore first study logic, next the various branches of mathematics in their proper order, then physics, and lastly metaphysics. Right? What is reasonable? First study logic. Then he says math. Why math? Math isn't necessarily a philosophy that's going to help you understand metaphysics, is it? But yes, it fits with logic. 2 plus 2 is 4. Always. Right? How things work. That there's reason in the basis of this universe. Then physics. Know what the world is like, and then you can move on to metaphysics. Solomon, as expatiated in the book of Proverbs, on sluggards and their indolence, by which he figuratively refers to indolence as a search after wisdom. He thus speaks of a man who desires to know the final results, but does not exert himself to understand the preliminary disciplines which lead to them, doing nothing else but desire. Solomon therefore indicates not only that such a man is righteous, who gives to everything its due portion, that is to say, who gives the study of a thing the whole time required of it. We need to learn from what Solomon said, the wise Solomon, that it takes time to gain wisdom, to grow wisdom, that there's work that must be done, and then, and only then, can you approach the truth. Maimonides says the fourth reason is taken from the physical constitution of man. He argues that it has been proved that moral conduct is a preparation for intellectual progress, and that only a man whose character is pure, calm, and steadfast can attain to intellectual perfection, that is, acquire correct conceptions. Now, we might want to disagree with Maimonides here, right? This idea of being proved, right? That we're going to say there's a lot of brilliant people who are immoral, debased, and wrong. Both history and fiction is filled with these characters. The Hannibal Lecters or Sherlock Holmes, who dabble a little bit too much with the wrong side of morality, but are otherwise brilliant. But if we're wanting to say acquire correct conceptions, ideas that are true and not just those that advance them in their own psychopathy, then maybe he's right. He's going to continue that students must also have a good teacher and be willing to learn. If your teacher doesn't have sufficient knowledge, you're not going to gain anything from them. And if you're not willing to learn, regardless of how brilliant your instructor is, then again, you're not going to be prepared to learn. And both of this requires a certain amount of moral conduct on both ends. Your instructor can't just fake it till he makes it. And you have to engage in the rigors of study. You need to do the reading, do the work along the way. Therefore, the rule, the headings of the sections may be confided to him, is further restricted in the Talmud. Right, once again, we're going back to the religious text to help explain human nature in the following way. The headings of the section must only be handed down to an Ab Bet Din, the president of the court, whose heart is full of care, in whom wisdom is united with humility, meekness, and the great dread of sin. It is further states there that the secrets of the law can only be communicated to a counselor, scholar, and a good orator. That these qualities can only be acquired if the physical constitution of the students favor their development. That you're going to already be wise and smart before you're going to get all of the moral teachings to add on top of that. That there's going to be a little bit of this and a little bit of that that are necessary to produce great works. Additionally, students must possess more than the ability to learn, but the requisite skills. Oration is good, but you also need to convey the concepts. Can you speak it, or do you understand them? Can you give examples, or is it just, I'm able to read what's in front of me? That this becomes the challenge of learning, and you being able to address these issues and say them to somebody else is also those skills that you're developing as a philosopher by reading these other philosophers. This is why you need to engage with others in discussions about what you saw and what you learned, what your takeaways were. Right? This shows that you have these skills. Others are intelligent and naturally clear-sighted, are able to convey complicated ideas in concise and well-chosen language. Such a person is called a good orator, but he has not been engaged in the pursuit of science or has not acquired any knowledge of it, right? It's just because you're able to read off of a teleprompter doesn't mean that you're wise. You need to know what's the meaning of those words. And that's why, again, you need to engage with others. The fifth reason, he continues, is that man is disturbed in his intellectual occupation by the necessity of looking after the material wants of the body. Right? You have certain needs that you need. That's why we call them needs. It's going to be really hard to advance your study if you're starving or being attacked by a wild animal or too hot or too cold or anything else, right? You have to find those optimum ranges where you're able to dive into your intellectual pursuits. Too many of us are busy earning a living to read some other works or dive in or take this class or whatever, right? So this is possibly one of those reasons why we have you leave high school as a young adult and go where? To where your needs can be more modest and you can learn from others in this way, right? That this is the natural progression, possibly. Right? He says especially this is the case if the necessity for providing for wife and children are superadded, right? Much more if he seeks superfluities in addition to his ordinary ones. By the custom of these bad habits, these might become a powerful motive. If you've got other family obligations, it makes the rest of your life, to study academics, for instance, a lot harder. It's a lot easier to do this if you're completely focused on just study and learning. If you're married, have children, etc., that this is going to make your study difficult. Even the perfect man to whom we have referred, if too busy with these necessary things, much more so if busy with unnecessary things and filled with a great desire for them, must weaken or altogether lose his desire for study, to which he will apply himself with interruption, lassitude, and want of attention. Again, if you have obligations, you're obliged to them, and that makes study more difficult. For these reasons, it was proper that the study of metaphysics should have been exclusively cultivated by privileged persons and not entrusted to the common people. Now, this kind of flies in the face of what many of us modern Americans think with notions of egalitarianism, but he's going to say, no, most people are too otherwise occupied. Therefore, you need to have privilege to be able to go to school, right? This is, in some ways, doesn't fit with our notions of a meritocracy. But there's an element of truth to it. The wisest and most brilliant person, if they're having to work to support their family, doesn't get to exercise their skills. Again, hopefully we can cultivate a society that can allow for these obligations to be put aside to allow for the brilliant person to excel. That we're able to offer loans for education. We're able to have enough of a safety net where young, ambitious, intelligent people are able to go and learn. That we're not going to say that you're not privileged enough, that you're not coming from the right family or anything else, that you can't learn. But there are other obligations which make it hard to learn, and we don't like this idea of eliminating a meritocracy, but this is kind of what Maimonides is at least hinting towards, that you need to have the certain people, and again, not just by birth, but other conditions that will allow it. It is not for the beginner, and he should abstain from it, as the little child as to abstain from taking solid foods and from carrying heavy weights. That you need to know your limits, physical and mental, and not be otherwise too preoccupied. So what have we learned from Moses Maimonides today, the Rambam? We learned that before we begin study, that we need to pause and reflect. We need to know what our limits are. What are our external limits? Do you not have time? Do you not have the resources? Do you not have the opportunity? And also, what are your internal restrictions? Are you wise enough? Are you prepared enough? Are you tired and fatigued? Is there too much on your plate that you need to say no to one thing before moving to the other? And this also leads to his via negativia, that we can't say some things on some subjects because our knowledge, our limitations are too great. And that this is a step beyond what Dionysius would say. That this uses Aristotle as well to help us understand that there is a balancing act, that Aristotle's discussion of how we're going to acquire virtues, this golden mean, is also how we're going to acquire wisdom and health and many other things. So hopefully Maimonides wasn't too complicated for some of you. The Guide for the Perplexed is a guide for those of you who are perplexed, and for many it is perplexing and you need a little bit more of a guide along the way through it, but it's there.